My name is Matt O'Malley. I am the City Councilor proudly representing District 6, as well as the Chair of the Council's Committee on Environment, Sustainability and Parks. I'm joined with my dear colleague and friend and collaborator on so many great environmental initiatives, City Councilor at Large Michelle Wu. And today we are here to discuss docket number 0185, which is an order for a hearing on the feasibility of requiring all new municipal buildings to comply with net zero carbon requirements in Boston. I want to thank my co-sponsor on this order again, Councilor Michelle Wu, for her partnership on issues related to climate mitigation and adaptation and so much more. I especially want to thank the members of the Boston Clean Energy Coalition, many of whom are with us this afternoon, for their incredible and unwavering advocacy. I'm going to break the rules of the chamber and say let's hear a round of applause for the members of the Boston Clean Energy Coalition for their great work. Specifically wanted to mention Ricky Harvey and Chris Schaffner. Ricky is here. Chris couldn't make it, but he has been our resident expert and just an amazing guy, as well as Joan Fitzgerald, Henrietta Davis, Matt Kiefer, so many others. Over the last 2 years, we have worked in concert with researchers, with academics, with lawyers, with architects, with other stakeholders through a series of working sessions and hearings on net zero carbon. In order to achieve net zero carbon, the total amount of energy used by the building on an annual basis must be equal to the amount of renewable energy created off-site or on-site. Through this work, we identified policy suggestions such as measuring the floor area ratio from the interior walls as opposed to the exterior wall, which is some work we did in concert, Councilor Wu and I, with Councilor Frank Baker, as well as other resolutions and strategies going forward. Today's hearing, I won't say is the culmination of the work, but it is one crucial part of the culmination of that work, because it is high time for Boston to lead with its own real estate portfolio. Last January, the Boston Green Ribbon Commission released the Carbon-Free Boston Report, which identified specific and measurable steps the city must take to meet its goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. While the congestion fee led most of the media coverage, one of the biggest takeaways I felt was that one of the most effective ways we can address this is looking at our buildings, which account for more than 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, buildings account for more, as I said, more than 70% of Boston's emissions, and in 2016, Boston emitted 6.4 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. I don't need to tell the people in this room that we are in the midst of a building boom. About 5 million square feet of new building space has been added each and every year since 2014. Now, I see this problem disguised as an opportunity. We obviously must be working with the private sector to do everything we can to get net zero carbon on the pipeline with the new development, but we can start by leading with example, which is why Councilor Wu and I today are calling for having a plan in place so that all new municipal buildings will be net zero carbon. This is something that will be good for the planning of the city's future, for our resiliency, for how we deal with these dramatic weather events that we're seeing as a coastal city, and we will also see a return in savings when we invest in these resilient buildings. So we're going to hear from just 2 panels. The first panel will be the mayoral administration panel. Then we have 6 experts on the second panel. We'll open it up for public testimony after that. This hearing is being recorded and broadcast on cable as well as streamed at boston.gov. We are happy to stay as long as it takes. There is a sign-in sheet in the back for folks who aren't part of our first or second panel that would like to testify. We'll make sure that we're here as long as everyone has an opportunity to weigh in. And before I turn over the panel, I wanted to invite Councilor Wu for any opening thoughts.
I'll just say thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your continued leadership, and always exciting to partner on these ideas. I think the council and the administration have had now a really great track record of figuring out the steps that we can take immediately that are within city jurisdiction and using that to make sure that Boston continues to be a leader for the country, as there's been a vacuum of leadership on climate from other levels of government. So proud to partner with so many great community activists and leaders on this effort as well. And also just would love to, well, we'll get into it more in questions, but noting that this dovetails nicely with the timing around the city's Build BPS initiatives, as well as lots of conversations on other places where we have a municipal footprint, not carbon footprint, but a municipal building or property that may be redeveloped or built up on, and how this could also add opportunity there. But thank you very much to everyone who will testify and speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Our first panel will introduce themselves. We will start with Director of Public Facilities, Tricia Lyons. If you just want to introduce yourself, go down the line, and then if you had any opening thoughts or comments.
Okay.
Ms. Lyons?
As you said, Councillor, I'm Tricia Lyons. I'm the Director of the Public Facilities Department for the city.
Chris Cook, Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston.
Kat Eschel, Carbon Neutrality Program Manager for the City of Boston.
Welcome
And,
all.
if it pleases you, Mr. Chair, I do have
course.
some opening remarks.
Please, Chief.
Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, we're also joined by several members of the hardworking staff of the Environment Department, including Allison Brezius, the Director of Climate and Environmental Planning, as well as Maura Zlody, who is actually heads our Interagency Green Building Council and is responsible mostly for the Article 37 review that takes place in coordination with the Boston Planning Development Agency. So I just want to thank them for their hard work. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. It's hard to imagine a more important topic than reducing our carbon emissions. The task is the defining issue of our time. Mayor Walsh and the City of Boston are committed to carbon neutrality by the year 2050, along with our fellow Metro mayors, and in accordance with our C40 commitments. And in fact, we're actually exceeding our C40 commitments at this point. It is these reasons that Mayor Walsh asked the Green Ribbon Commission to commission a study to see how Boston, in its specific set of circumstances, could achieve the goal of neutrality. And this is the report, Councillor, that you mentioned in your opening remarks. The report, Carbon Free Boston, was completed by the Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy, and it presents a compelling argument for early and aggressive action in Boston's building sector. This is something that the advocacy community did not need a report to tell them, and it's something they've been advocating for quite some time. However, it does represent a roadmap and a possible set of solutions for dealing with our specific set of greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings account for roughly 70% of Boston's emissions. The path to neutrality falls into three core actions. Buildings need to be as efficient as possible. Systems generally need full electrification, and those systems need to be powered by renewable sources. A few brief remarks. One is, and again, because the advocates are here in this room, many of whom, along with the City Council and along with Mayor Walsh's support, push for community choice energy, we are very excited about the position and the path that the city is on to increase the source of renewables in our energy mix. This will make buildings and their energy efficiency more possible as we move forward. Also, I want to recognize the program Renew Boston Trust. The first phase of Renew Boston Trust is underway, and that is to install energy and conservation measures or renewable generation on municipal buildings. And it's led by the extraordinary leadership of my counterpart, Trish Lyons, who's joining me here today. That uses the energy retrofits to actually provide capital financing for different municipal projects while increasing the efficiency of those buildings. Last year's fiscal commitment to that was $11 million. In the upcoming fiscal years, it'll be $70 million. If carbon-free Boston is the what of what we need to do, our current climate action plan and its update is going to be the how. There are enormous equity concerns when you start talking about carbon neutrality goals. Who we do it to and how we do it are very, very important, and they're as important as the why. The Carbon Free Boston report was sequenced to inform the launched update of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. To demonstrate the collaborative nature of the Climate Action Plan and its important work, it's important to note the members of the steering committee. The steering committee, probably most prominently and most importantly for the purposes of this hearing, includes the Public Facilities Department, includes the Budget Office, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, the Boston Transportation Department, the Inspectional Service Department, the Public Works Department, Economic Development, the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Racial Equality, and the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and the Legal Office. Also, it's very important that this year's Climate Action Plan update is going to have significant public outreach. We want to hear mostly from the Bostonians that our Climate Action Plan is going to affect. These updates to the Climate Action Plan will most likely include zoning changes and changes to Article 37 to make sure that we are lightening focus on reducing our carbon emissions, especially in our building sector. As I said, buildings account for 70% of Boston's emissions. It's important to note that Carbon Free Boston also predicts that 80% of the existing building stock in our city will likely still exist by 2050 when we have to hit our carbon neutrality goal. So the challenge of this sector, the challenge of these emissions is really about retrofits and finding finance models to make them possible. I've tried to be as brief as possible to allow for public comment, so I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
Thank you, Chief. Director Lyons, Director Eshel, any opening thoughts before we get into it?
I'd just like to
Sure.
sort of add to what Chief Cook was talking about in terms of this being a very exciting moment, I think, for the city. I think that under the chiefs, I think the chief is very generous to say that Renew Boston Trust is being led by public facilities. In reality, it's a joint effort, and I think that under the chief's leadership, we're in a period of collaboration among city agencies that we certainly haven't seen in a long time, and I think that opens great opportunities for continued improvement in how we do our business in the city. So I just wanted to add that Chief Cook is a great leader in this environment here.
I could not agree with you more on that sentiment, and we are very pleased. It's probably been 6 months or so, maybe a little north of that, Chief, since you've been on the job, and I know personally you've been a great partner in all these things, and I know the people behind you would agree, so thank you for that. Sometimes these hearings could be a little tense, and that's just faded away, and that's a very good thing. So, Chief, I couldn't agree with you more also on the equity goals, how, as it relates to NZC, how we do it, and to whom we do it is important. So we can solve that right now by saying we're going to do it to all new municipal buildings
Right.
going forward.
So I think there's an important distinction there of the core functions of some of these municipal buildings and the way that we spend capital funds. Now, of course, this is much more in Trish's bailiwick, so feel free to jump in when I get over my skis. New construction, zero net carbon, is far more plausible than it is with retrofits.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it's impossible with retrofits at all.
Sure.
It just means that as we approach capital programming and what are the goals of that capital programming, when you make value judgments, and it's difficult to make a value judgment that's more important than the sustainability of our species when you compare it to global warming, yet we still have to make value judgments at things like a school still has to be a school, still has to be a classroom, it has to be open. You have to spread that capital budget and distribute it over as much as possible. When you're looking at retrofit systems, you want to retrofit into systems that are tried and true and that are going to last the normal capital life of how long you expect that to be. When you're starting from scratch, I think the planning is far easier for zero net carbon. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't approach both. It just means that there's a different set of decisions, and it's going to have to be a slightly different plan through the climate action
Sure.
plan, this collaborative nature of how we get to zero net carbon in our existing buildings.
Could not agree with you more.
Yeah.
And I think and I want to hear from you, Trish, but before, I think our plan all along from the Net Zero Working Group has been focused on municipal buildings, new commercial and private buildings.
Right.
Then we get to retrofits, and obviously municipal retrofits would theoretically kick off our sort of retrofits. But I guess the question now is the city committed to having net zero carbon on all new, not retrofits, but all new municipal buildings going forward, schools, police stations, municipal stations?
So what I would say is that I think it's important through the work of the climate action plan to develop that specific goal in the most inclusive manner possible. The climate action plan includes a lot of departments that touch that capital budget and touch the programming capacity of those budgets. We will certainly strive to get to net zero carbon emissions on as much as possible as in any building that gets built. But I do think that there's going to be some program decisions along the way given the typology of some of those buildings. That being said, we can't, and I don't mean to change the direction of what you just said, but I do think Renew Boston Trust and that model that we're using is actually a way to accelerate the very difficult work that you identified in the retrofit arena. And I think that we're demonstrating with this first phase of efficiencies where the savings are actually paying for themselves, that the retrofit area may actually be a place that we may be able to more aggressively spend quicker. Now, that being said, we also don't build that many new buildings on an annual basis. And typically, the parks capital budget cycle runs in 3 to 5 year capital cycles. It would be hard to imagine a climate action plan update that didn't result in very stringent carbon neutrality regulations. So.
But in addition, I'd like to hope that, you know, as this collaboration continues, that we as a city plan our steps forward very carefully. I think that the chief just referred to systems that are tried and true. I think it's very dangerous when, if as a city organization, we sort of leapt into new systems or new technology that's not tested and that is very complex and unable to be maintained. There are certain balances, I think, that we need to take as a city and join together and break through whatever roadblocks there might be toward getting to the place we need to be to support those systems, to support that technology. But I think in working together, we can sort of figure out a way to do that.
No, I appreciate that, yeah.
I think we can give an example, if it's all right, give an example of the current technology going into the planning of the Boston Arts Academy.
Sure, sure. So one of the things that is happening is we are sort of progressing as we go through the design of especially our new buildings. Over the years, you know, our goal has been, our mandate has been to achieve LEED Silver or better. So if I look at a couple of recent examples, the bowling building in Dudley Square, that achieved LEED Gold. The new Dearborn STEM Academy is tracking LEED Gold, and there are several great energy savings technologies built into that school. But most recently, we are completing the design of the new Boston Arts Academy. So we're sort of taking that one step further. And we're building things in like, you know, high efficiency building envelopes that allow us to install maybe smaller HVAC systems that use less energy, that provide better acoustics in a building, that allow us to be much more efficient with our heating and cooling. Those systems in that particular building are being installed as all electric for the HVAC system, so that as we move down the road toward the 2050 carbon neutral, we're setting ourselves up, you know, to sort of meet those goals.
So just to be clear about that, not to put, you know, not to get too wonky and into weeds, although I think we're going to hear from some pretty wonky.
Well, we're getting in the weeds.
Yeah,
today.
exactly. So that's exciting. But a relatively more fully electrified system lends itself to when the renewable energy is able to come into the building. That is when we'll see the dramatic drop in the carbon emissions of that building. So that leadership that Public Facilities has taken on Boston Arts Academy actually positions that building well to increase its carbon emissions, to reduce its carbon emissions profile as it moves forward.
And save money. I mean, the energy cost can with a heat pump system can be decreased by as much as 40%.
So this is the exciting part, is that we're very excited about the update to the Climate Action Plan update and the input from all the other city departments and of course the external stakeholders. And we really look forward to having this discussion throughout this update, because the city is actually in a very unique position. A lot of the arguments that you sometimes hear from the development community in the city of Boston has to do with the cost, the incremental cost of actually adding carbon neutrality goals into the construction mix. The city is in the very unique position that it is highly unlikely that a city would actually get rid of the building itself. It certainly would not flip it to change its use or anything like that. Police stations generally stay police stations. Schools generally stay schools, and especially any building that would be new in the city. So the city is almost uniquely positioned to receive all the benefits of the energy savings over time, theoretically to make the capital costs pay for themselves. The reason we say theoretically is that according to the Green Building Council, there's still an adding cost to building buildings that are certainly zero net energy, but also zero net carbon. And that can track anywhere from like 11 to 20%, depending on which report you're looking at. There was a University of Vermont report that had as high as 25%, and the Green Building Council, I think, has it more in the 16% range. Those costs are important because what you have to build into the capital cycle is that those costs don't come at the cost of program on something like a school. And so you look at things like school kitchens, you look at things, and it should never be an either or, and it doesn't have to be as long as you build it into the capital budget from the get-go.
Yeah, and just folks watching have to understand that we talk about two different budgets in that case. We have a capital budget that we vote on, we have sort of the city's operating budget, I guess 3, and then BPS, which is its own separate budget. Your point is well taken, and again, we're going to hear from our second panel about some of the costs, including from the Carbon Free Boston report, which pegs the citywide cost of energy in 2050 could decline by $600 million from carbon neutral buildings. So we are going to continue to push this and argue that it makes the most best financial stewardship we'll get to focus on these buildings. So I want to get to my colleagues. We've also been joined by City Councilor Frank Baker from District 3 and City Councilor Ed Flynn from District 2. Welcome, gentlemen. How many municipal buildings do we currently have in the pipeline for construction, would you say right now, Tricia? Ballpark, from schools to community centers to housing developments?
I can't speak to the whole 5-year capital plan off the top of my head, unfortunately. I
Okay.
can tell you we've probably got about 60 or 70 in the pipeline between design and construction at public facilities now. I would say probably over the next 5 years, there's probably triple that.
60 to 70 now and over the
And
next...
I'm sort of speaking of
It's ballpark,
projects,
yeah.
rather than individual
And does that
buildings.
include when you've got like a 125 Amory Street, for example? I think you were with us in the mayor last week. It's going to be sort of a hybrid city building with support from JPNDC, community builders and others. Is that included in sort of our municipal portfolio?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the address.
It's in Jamaica Plain. It's an elderly BHA development that they're growing on-site affordability.
No, I'm sorry, no.
Okay, so that's not included?
That's not in
They
the
do have
capital.
PV paneling on the roof. I don't think they're quite NZC yet, but it's a very good,
Great.
they've already begun some of the work. And then, are we all up to date on our BERDO, the Boston Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance for our municipal buildings?
That's an excellent question, Kat. Do you know the answer to that? We could get back to you.
We can get back to you on that. So, yeah, municipal buildings do report to BERDO every
Yeah.
single year, and they have been
We wrote the
reporting.
legislation so that it was the first to comply. I believe they
Counselor,
had. This is going back to Mayor Menino. Predates all of you. Well, it doesn't predate you, Chris, but you were in a very different role then.
I apologize for cheating, but Allison Breezius told me that, yes, we have responded.
Thank you, thank you, Allison. It's not cheating. It's a lifeline. On Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And Allison would be the one I would call if ever I
Okay,
was on Who
all
Wants to Be a Millionaire. All right, so that information would be helpful because I guess again.
We absolutely provide that to you. I think there's, just to be clear, the important distinction about what's in the pipeline for new construction as opposed to
Right.
retrofits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the whole point. In the Carbon Free Boston report, and I know that it is, although it was your department chief working in concert with academics and researchers and others, it notes that deep energy retrofits, we need to, I'm reading almost verbatim from it, ensuring that all new construction meets high performance standards, carbon neutrality will require, on average, deep energy retrofits to between 2,000 and 3,000 buildings each year. Is that beginning this year?
Oh, yeah. And
Okay.
so we would have to start this year. So we're lagging a little bit behind this year.
Yeah.
Right? There's 86,000 buildings
Yeah.
in Boston. Nearly all of them have fossil fuels coming into them.
Yeah.
So that can be daunting. We could look at that as what it is, which is it's a huge challenge. Or the flip side of that is we could look at it as this is the huge opportunity. And this is potentially the best jobs program the United States of America
Agreed.
has ever seen.
Agreed.
There's a huge market, and there's also an opportunity to combine this with some of our resilience and our adaptive strategies. So the very simple equation is when you have to put the HVAC system on the roof, it's also a good opportunity to electrify the HVAC system and make sure there's as many renewable energy, as much renewable energy in the portfolio of that building as possible. Just on that point, if it's all right for Kat to speak to it, there's an exciting new program coming out of Department of Neighborhood Development right now.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the Department of Neighborhood Development. They've been working since 2013 on an energy positive green building program. So this is a program that's done in collaboration with the Boston Planning and Development Agency as well as the Environment Department. And so through that program, they have actually been building market rate and affordable housing on city-owned land. And so there's about 100 units that have either been built or in the pipeline in neighborhoods like Roxbury. So that's a really exciting program where they're piloting energy positive development, where they're challenging local developers and architects to try out these technologies, and it's been a great success so far.
Thank you, Kat. I just want to give my colleagues time, and I know one of our panelists has to leave early, but I would just say that as daunting as the 2,000 to 3,000 retrofits are, the best way, in my opinion, to get ahead of that is to make sure that all new construction, beginning with municipals, are NZC and energy positive. That's the way that we can load up on the work now. Councillor Wu?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everyone. Thank you for everything that you do day to day. Just to follow up a little bit, I guess maybe to back up one step first and just to understand, because we're talking about different kind of metrics for success when we're talking about carbon neutrality, et cetera. So, Tricia, you'd mentioned that the Dearborn is LEED Gold, and that the
Tracking.
tracking to LEED Gold, even if it's not certified or whatever it is at the end. But that is, I was just quickly Googling. So there's now a LEED Zero certification that would actually be more of the carbon-free certification that this hearing order is talking about. Is that correct?
It's a standard. It's a standard that just came out a couple months ago, so we're looking into it and seeing how that could work with our current requirements. But it's very new.
Okay.
So we're still
But if
studying
assuming
it.
that that's the standard for kind of what this hearing order is talking about in terms of net zero requirements, how much of an additional lift is it to get from certifiable LEED Gold to potentially, although it's new?
It's an interesting question, Councillor. I mean, if you're talking about the specific building, unfortunately, the answer is it depends, and that's a very bureaucratic answer, unfortunately. But every building gets to LEED certification in a different way. Humbly, and I haven't spent time with the LEED Zero requirements, I think that's going to be obviously very specific to carbon emissions, but we'd have to look at it through the Article 37 update. But we could potentially look at a building like the Dearborn and get that answer back to you. So we do have the general numbers again from the Green, Building Council about the additionality of adding zero carbon requirements onto buildings. But so many buildings, their portfolios are very different because of usage, but also because of where they're situated. So some are better candidates for passive energy, some are better candidates for solar, and that's where design really has to drive a lot of this. I don't know if there's anything.
To clarify, Chief Cook was mentioning a report that will be coming out from the U.S. Green Building Council, so talking about the additional incremental cost of making buildings either net zero ready, so where the systems are electrified, and if you were to procure 100% clean energy, they would then be carbon neutral, or to the incremental cost of making those buildings zero net carbon. So that report hasn't been released yet, but we can get back to you on that.
Okay.
But to Councilor O'Malley's earlier point, theoretically, especially with energy savings, over time, energy savings, if capitalized properly, could pay for themselves.
Okay. So it at least appears, and there will be some analysis, or there already is some analysis on whether, because it sounds like we are already in terms of facilities thinking about comparison to LEED as certain, reaching that the LEED Gold standards are in consideration, if not targets, as the city is thinking about projects right now, even if you don't go for the full certification, but basically getting the buildings up to the point where they match or would meet those requirements?
So for new buildings, yes. Our goal, our mandate is LEED Silver as a minimum. Our goal is to exceed that. The in terms of LEED Zero, we still have, obviously some work to do with our partners here to understand really what that is. As you know, when we build a new building and we apply for LEED, we apply for LEED sort of early on in the design process. So as we are building a project, we may be building it under one iteration of LEED, but in the meantime, more and more iterations of LEED continue to come out. And so our projects are progressing as LEED progresses as well.
Got it.
And Counselor, I know you know this point, but obviously the big challenge here is whether or not we would have to be very specific and intentional in our Article 37 update and our Climate Action Plan update to really talk about specifically carbon neutrality in buildings, because when you look at LEED, the existing LEED certifications, gold, silver, there are other quality of life measures that are very important, and that they're things that absolutely are integral into building healthy and equitable buildings, things like air quality, things like, there's points you can receive for the types of transportation, the type of building envelope that you have. There are things that may not directly deal with carbon emissions.
All right.
Okay. Is there a timeline for kind of analyzing the LEED Zero new standard or?
Yeah, so that's part of the conversation that we're having for the Climate Action Plan update. So we have been convening a working group comprised of key stakeholders and community groups. So in the building sector, for example, we have representatives from trade unions, from developers, architects, utilities, as well as community groups.
And that's set to be done this fall?
So we're looking at a timeline of summer, fall, yeah.
Summer, fall 19, okay.
So we're convening a working group, and it's talking about strategies that we need to accelerate as a community. And so part of that is getting some of these experts in the room who can speak to the right building standards when we're talking about zero net carbon new construction. So LEED is one standard, but then you also have other standards like passive house. LEED Zero is something new. And so what we're doing as a community through the working group is talking about, okay, if our strategy is to update Article 37 so that we can reach a zero net carbon standard, what does that look like, and what is the process to get to that point?
So just to back up, maybe this is super basic, I apologize. Tricia, when you said the mandate is for LEED Silver, that is in Article 37? Or what do you mean by mandate?
There was a municipal, sorry.
No, there's a city ordinance.
So there is an
That
existing
requires it.
ordinance requiring new buildings to be LEED Silver?
New buildings and major renovations
Okay.
to achieve LEED Silver.
Of city property? And that, when was that passed?
My guess is 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're really just talking about an amendment then at this point. Okay, so, we're going to dig up all the background information on that.
We're happy to provide that ordinance to the council.
Thank you. And just to put a finer point on Councilor O'Malley's earlier question, you had mentioned 60 to 70 projects in the pipeline, but in terms of new sort of ground up buildings, it's not.
It's much fewer.
Yeah, like West Roxbury, the the school project.
It would be the Boston Arts Academy. There's a new East Boston Police Station. There's not a whole lot of new buildings.
Okay.
There's only a few, actually.
Okay, so
Major renovations.
But it does feel, I heard that there was some sense that, we need to wait and kind of tie with other initiatives or processes or plans, but that many of the decisions about how these buildings are going to turn out in the next 5 years are either already have been made or are being made now. And so I am sensing some urgency just to make sure that we are not missing huge entire opportunities that are few and far between as they come up, that will then be there. The new police station will be there for who knows how long. What is the general, what kind of life cycle are you building, for example, that police station for?
So a typical project will take 3 to 5 years.
And then how long will it be there, do you think?
After it's built, 50 or more years.
Okay,
Yeah.
so thinking about that scale of impact with the decisions that we're making now and the standards that we're setting, I imagine that part of the motivation behind that ordinance that was passed probably 10 years ago around LEED Silver was also this kind of, if we're going to ask the private sector to help us meet our goals, we have to be the ones leading as well. And you would agree that that's kind of still the mindset that we
No, it is, and I think that's where we have some real opportunities, especially while we're in the early master planning stages of some of our campuses. So when you start looking at something like the Franklin Park yard, now just to be clear, that's not Franklin Park proper, which is going through a different master plan process. That's the public-facing side of Franklin Park, the 500 acres that the public use. But we actually have a small campus there that's gone through a recent master plan, which is a programming exercise, and it's what houses the Boston Parks and Recreation Department. There's about 140 or so municipal workers that report there every day. On site, we have incredibly inefficient buildings that are beautiful, and there would be some landmarks conversations that we would have to engage in order to make them efficient. But there's opportunities for retrofits, and then there's opportunities for things like a greenhouse that actually could be totally heated through just the compost that we actually generate on site at the park. So I think the real opportunities for the new constructions are the opportunities that is still in that master planning stages. Once something's in the design cycle, I think the opportunity is to create the opportunity for renewable electricity to get into that building when it comes time for the conversion.
Okay. I just had one more question, or maybe a set of questions. So we are now aiming at the 50% by 2030 goal. So I guess the question is, are we going to hit that goal, and what scale of change, if you could describe in some way what scale of change is necessary for us to get there, particularly around municipal buildings?
Particularly around municipal buildings, I think is a tougher. I'll let Kat Eschel start to answer that question, because she's forgotten more about our greenhouse emissions than I'll ever remember, or however that phrase is supposed to go. But then I do have a caveat to add at the end of it. So.
Yeah, so for municipal buildings in particular, I think it's about the work of the Renew Boston Trust, and so engaging in those energy efficiency measures and using this self-funding financing mechanism that's been developed. So through energy performance contracting, that's sort of the term of art that we use to describe that sort of financial mechanism for engaging in these retrofits. And so that's going to play a huge role in terms of allowing the city to borrow enough money and underwrite more in order to be able to spend more on our own buildings and bring those buildings back up to snuff.
I guess just to clarify my question.
Yeah.
We have a specific numerical goal that we need to hit by 2030, and we have a plan now that I imagine has certain levels of detail that go beyond what was even publicly available of where are all the levers and how hard do we need to, or how much do we need to be pushing them up or down to get there. So by 2030, what percentage of or how much do we need to have reduce the carbon footprint, for example, of municipal buildings?
The Carbon-Free Boston analysis didn't specifically look at municipal buildings. They identified it as an option. And so the full technical report hasn't been released yet.
When will that come out?
The last I heard from the team at the Boston University and the Green Ribbon Commission was that it was expected to be released at the end of April, early May. But we would be more than happy to put you in touch with the researchers at Boston University to allow you to drill down into those numbers a bit more.
So do you think that will include a goal of our municipal buildings need to have this percentage smaller footprint by 2030 to hit the goal?
No, I don't think so, because, so this is the part where I go to the caveat. So the first part of your question, to just answer it generally, we're tracking ahead of our goals. Unfortunately, the really difficult work is still ahead of us. That's sort of the issue, right? So the issue of buildings, and that's contributing to 70%, and most of those buildings are already built. So the clean energy, and I don't mean to minimize what a Herculean effort the advocates have made and the leadership that the state has been showing with their, the 80% clean grid. In a lot of ways, we actually ride their clean energy grid goals to our path to carbon neutrality. The issue is the sectors that are left are very difficult, and they're building and transportation. A lot of the transportation is out of our control, and it's going to require a regional approach to get people who are driving in from 495 in out of their cars, or at least into electric cars, and then
I have a plan.
all the traffic. Good. Look forward to it. But the building sector, there's still a lot of work left, and so it's a little distracting that we're tracking so well right now on our path, because the really difficult work is still ahead of us.
And I think it just feels that it would be, I don't want to use the word irresponsible, but that we'd be leaving, we would not be holding ourselves fully accountable if we do not have a specific goal for municipal buildings and the carbon footprint there, because that is fully in our control, and that sets the tone for every other entity that owns a building.
I would be, there is no scenario where there's not a target goal for municipal buildings out of the Climate Action Plan update.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. Wanted to thank Councilor Flynn. He is going to defer. We're going to get to his questions next. I'm going to ask this panel to stay, but Seth Federspiel, who has been a great partner to us, he is the net zero energy planner for the city of Cambridge. He's helped us through this process. He has a hard deadline. He has to leave by 3. So, Seth, if you would mind going through your presentation, I believe we'll have some questions, and then we'll return to Councilor Flynn and the panels, but we invite you to stay. So, thank you, Seth. Yep.
Don't worry about pressing.
Yep, it's fine.
Well, thanks for inviting me here today. Looks like I'm working on pulling up the presentation.
Jessica's on it. Wanted to thank Jessica Morris from my team, who's helped put this together every step.
So again, my name is Seth Federspiel. I work for the City of Cambridge Community Development Department, where I'm an energy planner responsible for overseeing the Cambridge Net Zero Action Plan. So I'm just going to give a really brief presentation of an introduction to that plan and specifically how it affects municipal buildings in Cambridge, and then happy to answer any questions from that. So Cambridge, like Boston, has achieved to committing a carbon neutrality by 2050. And like Boston, the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our buildings. In Cambridge, it's over 80%. And to help address these emissions and create a pathway for eliminating over time the greenhouse gas emissions from the buildings, in 2015, the Cambridge City Council adopted the Net Zero Action Plan to lay out that pathway to phasing out greenhouse gas emissions from all buildings throughout the city, both municipal and private buildings. In Cambridge, we define net zero similarly to the net zero carbon definition that's been discussed here. So a building needs to have an annual balance of 0 greenhouse gas emissions from its energy consumption and its energy production over time. This is different than net zero energy. So it allows for off-site use of renewable energy technologies. So important to make that distinction. There are 5 major components of the Net Zero Action Plan, and these components really focus on existing buildings, new buildings, and then the renewable energy supply for Cambridge. So I'll be speaking for the rest of the time about new buildings in Cambridge. Okay. And what we did as part of the plan really came out of concern around the new building development in Cambridge. And so we laid out with the stakeholders who wrote the plan a timeline over which we would target achieving net zero emissions in those new building sectors over time. So I apologize that this is a little small, but so we start with municipal buildings in 2020, with small residential 1 to 3 unit buildings in 2022. And then in 2025, we bring in larger multifamily buildings, commercial buildings, and institutional buildings. And then labs are in 2030, acknowledging the particularly complicated technical nature of labs. We're committed to conducting a technical and economic feasibility assessment of achieving net zero emissions in each of these building sectors in the years leading up to adoption of the requirements in the Cambridge zoning, as the case would be. So we're starting that process now, or in this coming year, for those residential buildings that would be subject to the requirements in 2022. So for municipal buildings, you can go ahead to the next one. We have a phased approach to new municipal buildings and the standards that apply to those buildings. So upon adoption of the plan, we began to target net zero ready municipal buildings. And the definition of that is here, it's basically a building that has very low energy use and is designed in a way that it can accommodate renewable energy supply in the future. And the really simple way that we've defined this in Cambridge is a building that's fossil fuel free. So it's a building that is not using any fossil fuel on site, and so it's once that electricity that it is consuming switches over to 100% renewable electricity, then that building would achieve net zero emissions. So just a couple examples of these buildings in Cambridge. The Martin Luther King School, which opened in 2015, was our first kind of attempt at working towards net zero. This building is not 100% fossil fuel free. It does have a very small amount of gas on site, but it's the highest LEED rated school in the country. It has a very, very low EUI, and as you can see, every square inch of the roof is covered in solar, which produces about 50% of the building's electricity needs. So this was kind of our first foray into the process. Go ahead. A much smaller building is our recently opened community shelter on Massachusetts Avenue in Central Square. This building is 100% electric. You can see again the solar photovoltaics. It also has solar thermal, and both this and the Martin Luther King School utilize ground source heat pumps to provide the heating and cooling for the building. And then our current project that we're working on is the King Open School Complex. This is also going to be fossil fuel free. And then this leads us into the 2020 commitment to achieving net zero emissions in municipal buildings. And so again, the way that we anticipate achieving that commitment is by building buildings that are fossil fuel free and then actually acquiring the amount of renewable energy to power those, to meet 100% of those buildings' electricity demand. And so this building will also have a significant amount of solar on it, and we're right now in the process of researching pathways to procure that off-site renewable energy that we'll need to satisfy the remainder of the building's electricity demand. So that's the quick overview of the approach. I also just wanted to note that we do also have a strategy for the renewal of our buildings, because like Boston and the area as a whole, there are many more existing municipal buildings in Cambridge than there are new buildings. And so we adopted a municipal facilities improvement plan, which is a 5-year trajectory, a 5-year commitment to retrofitting buildings over time. And as part of that process, we adopted a 2020 greenhouse gas emission target for our portfolio of buildings. And right now we're in the process of updating that to reach a 2030 target. So that's the quick overview, and happy to answer questions that you have.
Thank you, Seth. We realize I think you have 4 minutes left, so we'll all take a minute, but this was great.
I can probably say 5 more minutes.
Did the Cambridge City Council actually put a policy to mandate that all those metrics, but specifically the 2020 new municipal buildings have to be NZC?
So the Cambridge City Council officially adopted the recommendations of the Net Zero Task Force, which is the Net Zero Action Plan. And then as we move through the plan, we go through the process of codifying each recommendation.
So the closer you get to 2020, that will be a zoning code change?
So municipal buildings are being undertaken under city policy, kind of internal city policy, but then for the private sector buildings, most likely through zoning changes.
Okay. And then in the first one, the MLK school, that was 2015 it was built, and it's not all electrified, pretty much. I assume it's probably a stove or something but everything else, 50% of their energy comes from PV panels on the roof?
Of their electricity, yes.
That's pretty remarkable. And then what were some of the, I guess I'll ask you a leading question that I know the answer to. Have there been any projects that you have been unable to do because of these guidelines? In other words, did you sacrifice programming at all as a city, so to meet these net zero carbon or close to it
Not to my
metrics?
knowledge.
Okay, good, thank you. Councilor Wu?
This is great. Thank you so much. I just feel so much potential and excitement seeing that our neighbors are already doing this. Can you talk a little bit more about the distinction between municipal and how you might have had to think through whether it's budgeting or what are the kind of factors that had to go into the analysis of when you could kickstart that effort or those requirements?
Yeah, so if you can flip back, is Jessica still there? It's not. Yeah, can you flip back a few slides to the timeline? So again, this outlines the technical and economic study that we're committed to doing before we adopt the net zero requirements for the private sector buildings. So it's specifically looking at the number of existing net zero buildings within that building type. So seeing that there is, precedent and that the market has an understanding of how to build that type of building. Again, looking at the industry itself and its capacity. So, are there experts? Do folks know what technologies are available and how to use those technologies to achieve net zero emissions? It's looking at the access to the renewable energy, either on-site or off-site, to power those buildings and allow them to achieve that balance of zero emissions over a year. And then looking at the cost. And including the costs and benefits over time and how the energy savings relate to the capital costs of the construction. And then also looking at kind of co-benefits. And one topic that I'm particularly excited about is the idea of energy resilience and the idea that buildings that use less energy can also be more resilient to the climate change that we're already seeing. So during a heat wave, a very efficient building will stay comfortable even without power. And same thing with during a cold spell, even without power, a very efficient building will stay at a much more constant temperature than a building that has a very leaky envelope.
Could you share the study or whatever piece was done just for the municipal portion of it? Or you said 2020, is it done or it's going to be done by 2020? Or?
So because we're meeting that commitment through kind of municipal policy, we're not doing this full cost benefit study.
Oh, great. You felt that it wasn't necessary.
Right. It's been
It's
more
just about political
kind of through the practice. And so that's where starting with the MLK school, and there's a little bit of gas, and then going to the King Open complex, which is fossil fuel free, and then our next school, for example, will be in the net zero timeframe. So it's kind of building up that experience.
So you just kind of decided you were going to do it and then did it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Councillor Flynn, these are questions for Seth, and then we'll get to your questions for the panel after.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley, and thank you for being with us today.
Sure.
We appreciate your input. What are some of the obstacles that you may have run into, or Cambridge may have run into, in trying to achieve net zero carbon? Anything you want to talk about on that subject?
Sure. So, in looking at the different technologies that we use for these buildings, sometimes there are physical or technological obstacles. So again, we've used ground source heat pumps as a source of heating and cooling for these buildings. They generally are a little more efficient than air source heat pumps, but they also require quite a bit of space and drilling far down. So the shelter building that I showed, the original plans were for ground source heat pumps, but they actually hit bedrock and couldn't drill any deeper, so had to switch to an air source heat pump technology. So sometimes there's kind of physical constraints there. I think, certainly there is always the conversation and understanding the capital budgets and how the budgets play off. One of the real challenges that we have, and one of the things that we're really hoping to learn from Boston and the Renew Boston Trust, is how do we capture operational savings and actually apply those to our capital budgets? Because in Cambridge, those are very divorced pots of money. And so, while these buildings are very cost effective when you kind of merge the two, if you're just looking at capital budget in isolation and not applying those savings over time, then it can be harder to justify those investments. And not only the operational savings, but also things like incentives from the state government and federal government that can help really improve the cost effectiveness of these projects. So one of the things that, again, we're hoping to learn from Renew Boston Trust about is how can we better kind of merge those financial flows and show the financial benefit of these very efficient buildings over time.
Then my last question, does Cambridge offer any incentives to potential new companies to move in that is interested in this field? And if so, what type of resources would you provide? What type of incentives? Or is the private sector actively working with the city government on this issue as well?
Sure. So most of the incentives for these clean building technologies come from the state. As you know, Massachusetts is very, very strong state energy efficiency incentives. And one of the things that we try to do both with our own projects and with private sector projects are to encourage those developers to work with the state and the utilities on those incentives very early in the project. The earlier in the project that you start looking at the incentives and the energy design, the more you can take advantage of those savings to achieve energy savings in the buildings. So that's where the majority of the monetary savings come from. What the city does provide is two things. We provide technical support to builders and building operators in Cambridge. So we have something called the Multifamily Pilot Program, which for medium-sized multifamily buildings leverages the state incentives, but the city has established an advisor service that can help buildings navigate that process and understand what the resources are. Often you get these really complicated energy assessments back, and it's hard to know how you actually operationalize that. So this advisor service is meant to help that. Through the Net Zero Action Plan, we're also studying other potential incentives for new buildings, such as potential density bonuses, so where there would be additional FAR granted to buildings that were to meet the net zero targets ahead of schedule. And so we're studying what the technical parameters of that policy would look like. We're studying that right now with the hope that it could move forward to adoption in the next year or so.
Thank you.
Seth, thank you so much for coming here, and I know you've stayed longer than you can, but we really I personally appreciate the friendship and leadership you've shown me. I love what you're doing in Cambridge and look forward to us joining you very, very shortly. So thank you very much.
All right, absolutely. Happy to be here. Sorry, I can't stay longer.
No, I understood. You're on a lunch break. You're a great, dedicated civil servant.
Thank you, Seth.
We have a public hearing on our green building zoning.
Oh, good. Excellent. All right. Excellent. Thank you again, Seth. Councilor Flynn, now you're up for the panel. Thank you again for letting us take Seth out of turn.
Well, thank you, Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Wu, for your leadership on this issue, and just want to thank the panelists for being here and for your leadership on this important issue as well. I just wanted to maybe ask the similar question that I asked to Seth, but is the city providing any, incentives, resources, tax assistance, tax breaks for building owners that might want to achieve net zero, or what type of assistance are we providing a company that may want to come to Boston and participate in this in a similar program?
So it's a good question, Councilor, and it's one that I can circle back with the Boston Planning and Development Agency and let you know. I will say that it's probably in the mix when they're balancing the community benefits of the project, but I think your question gets to, is there an actual specific incentive for this? And it's an interesting approach, particularly when you look at the fact that unless you are the long-term property owner, unless you intend to own this property for some time, the energy savings don't pay for themselves, and so it is an upfront cost. So the way we've been approaching it, again, through our Article 37 work and the work of the Interagency Green Building Committee that we have, along with the Boston Planning and Development Agency, is requiring buildings over 50,000 square feet to really submit their plan, how they're going to achieve the different goals that we're asking them. But I think it's an interesting twist to look at through the Climate Action Plan, especially since we have the economic development folks at the table, is how do you really incentivize this? Because a lot of those buildings that are being developed are not going to be owned by the entities that are actually developing them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Your point is well met.
Thank you. And I'm just on another issue. What can we do about older buildings, city buildings we have throughout the neighborhoods that certainly they're not environmentally friendly, and at times they're probably, for example, many of the older schools we have, the HVAC is using a lot of energy, and it's probably providing a lot of dust or chemicals into the air. I don't think they're all that healthy. They've been there for so long. But what can we do with some of these older buildings to make them more environmentally friendly, especially to our students, so that they they can study and they can learn in a better environment.
So Councilor, there's a couple things. I mean, there's the typical types of projects that we do through the capital plan that address many of the concerns that you mentioned. Not all of the projects in the plan, as you know, are major renovations or new construction. Many of them are sort of deferred maintenance type projects or upgrades. And as we address those buildings through those capital projects, we generally, it's sort of accepted practice now to make them more efficient and make them healthier in environments. So that's sort of one way that we address those older buildings. They sort of make their way into the capital plan and get put into the queue. In addition, as Chief Cook mentioned earlier, the Renew Boston Trust is a huge opportunity for us to accelerate a lot of those possibilities. We are currently, as you mentioned, in the first phase, which is somewhat of a pilot phase for us because this is a brand new way of delivering projects for the city. It's a brand new way of financing them. It's a brand new way of delivering them. It's a process that we sort of had to learn, and we're still learning about. We're in the construction phase right now, which I think is really a great hurdle for us in this pilot phase. We're looking forward to and starting to plan phase 2 of that. Now, the number of sites that we're planning in phase 2 are dramatically greater than what we did in our pilot phase. So I think as we become more accustomed to this new program and new project delivery method, we are going to accelerate our ability to address some of these systems.
And the only thing I would add to that, Counselor, is that phase 2 that we're rolling into, we don't lose any time rolling into the phase 2. It's really just releasing the funds because the properties have already been audited. After the phase 1 construction, which we're already currently in and moving into phase 2, that portfolio includes schools, so we can be very intentional about making sure that we're making improvements that increase things like the air quality, particulates that are in the air. To Seth's point, in his testimony, he spoke a lot about energy resilience, which gets to core equity issues that are associated and exacerbated by climate change. I think we have to be very intentional about how we actually distributed our highly limited capital resources and be intentional about which schools and which buildings get served first. And that's one of the exciting things we're excited about full participation in the climate action plan. And it's something that I actually should have mentioned at the very beginning. The outstanding leadership of the Boston Student Advisory Committee has been exceptional on this issue. They have a whole cohort that is focused on renewable energy and green buildings. Chief Brophy and I are actually meeting with the students in an upcoming meeting to discuss the matters that they're pushing forward. What I've been so heartened over the past few months that I've been in this position is that the young people fully understand how important this issue is, but also the implications it has for equity. So I think their full participation in the Climate Action Plan is really going to guide our Renew Boston Trust work.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Tricia. And my final question, I had the opportunity to, this week I was in the playground of the Josiah Quincy School in Chinatown with the principal and the assistant superintendent looking at security issues, but my son went there for several years as well. But their playground, it may be somewhat unrelated to this, but their playground is almost on the top of Mass Pike, and I always think of the children playing in the playground and the fumes coming up from the Mass Pike and close to the expressway system as well. But is there anything we can do targeting or looking at schools that are in difficult areas and making some changes? So as you mentioned, Commissioner, you talked about the air quality. I mean, that's a major concern for me is the air quality for our students. but is there anything that the city of Boston can do to ensure that our children that are playing in these playgrounds or parks, and if the park is already located in a situation that's not ideal, what can we do to improve the air quality for our young people?
All right, so Counselor, at the risk of getting overly excited about the fact that you just asked that question and the entire Environment Department rolling their eyes, one of the benefits that I have of the parks background is that I actually think landscape architecture is one of the solutions for a huge equity problem that we have with climate resilience. And that is something as basic as the heat island index for a lot of locations of our schools. You know, most of our schools in the time that they were built are fully surrounded by macadam. They're under tree, there's under tree canopy, and that does there's a ton of, you know, instead of co-benefits, there's a lot of co-anti-benefits, right? And so there isn't stormwater management on site, there isn't quality of air on site, and the places that our kids have to play are too hot. When they have the additionality of being located someplace where there's a lot of fossil fuels being burnt, it can lead to very poor air quality. So it doesn't matter how much money, and the Public Facilities Department does a terrific job working with BPS on renovating playgrounds. I think the communities themselves are starting to use Community Preservation Act as a great tool to renovate these playgrounds. But we need to start delving into the best practices of landscape architecture to incorporate nature-based solutions into making sure that these spaces are as green as possible. Nature has a way of cleaning air. In a lot of ways, humans have to get out of the way and just let nature do its thing. We have to reintroduce nature into our design. So there's a lot of opportunities to do that, and we look forward to partnering with the Public Facilities Department, certainly with the Schools Department, to make sure that we incorporate those designs.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you know, it's not a coincidence that the kids in Chinatown have the highest asthma rate of any neighborhood in the city, and it's because they're breathing in these fumes from the Mass Pike and the nearby expressway, and that's their parks, that's their open space, and that's their ball fields, and they're playing almost on top of these highway systems. So not only, I mean, I'm so happy that you're doing this, but it's also, you know, an opportunity to work closely with public health as well, get them involved and almost let them be part of the discussions that are taking place as well.
They have to be, and the problem is complex, as you identified, which means the solution has to be complex, and that's why the Climate Action Plan has such an intentionality around it, around equity, and we're very glad that the Boston Public Health Commission is part of that table. And by the way, we're not going to slow down. Whenever the Parks Department can participate in some of those solutions, we've been doing that as well.
Thank you to the panelists for your leadership on this important issue.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Just very briefly, before we bring up our second panel, are any municipal buildings currently all electrified or nearly all electrified? Are you aware?
We'd have to get back to you.
Yeah, I'd have to check on that.
Probably not, I'm assuming. But
I don't want to
yeah,
venture
no,
a
I understand.
guess.
I'm just more curious than anything else. And then, okay, I do want to get, we have a good panel and people have been waiting. I guess I would just say I appreciate it. I know we all want the same things here, and I guess I would just underscore the urgency. We have 11 years to get this right. This, you know, to really retrofit, to look at all new construction, to look at the existing building stock, we have to start somewhere, and the city needs to take a lead on this. And I know we all share that. So I'm just incredibly hopeful that going forward we can make this is just as if I were to say, you know, can we promise that all new municipal buildings will be handicap accessible? You would say, of course, that's our mandate, that's what we're going to do, and I hope that we start using net zero carbon as sort of is seen as the same way, just as just the norm and something that could be expected from every city building. So I thank you. I'd invite, did you have any closing comments? All right. Invite you guys to stay if you can. I know you've got a busy schedule, but we're going to hear from our second panel and our final panel now. Thank you all for your great work. I really do appreciate it.
Very grateful.
very
Thank you,
much.
councilors.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Jacob Knowles, Meredith Elbaum, Cammie Peterson, Mark Sandine, and Carol Oldham to please join us in the first, I think we've got 5, so you can all sit in there and maybe pull a chair over, or we can help you with that. Or if somebody wants their own, if somebody wants to sit on the end, you may as well. I'm pulling a chair. Okay, Carol's on it. Thank you.
Eversource phone. And resilient. I think we only need one chair. So now do we have?
Got 2 extra chairs. Put this one back.
How many environmentalists does it take to get an extra chair? All right. Thank you. So who would like to begin? Well, we'll go left to right. My left to your right, please. Just, if you just want to introduce yourself, your title, we'll go down the list, and then if you had an opening statement, we'll get into it before the questions.
I'm Jacob Knowles. I'm the Director of Sustainable Design at BR+A Consulting Engineers in Boston, a 370-person mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection engineering firm headquartered here in Boston.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Mark Sandine. I'm president of Mass Solar, which is a nonprofit organization working to ensure fair and equitable access to solar for everyone in the Commonwealth. I have been the chair of Sustainable Lexington, which is a Lexington Board of Selectmen appointed committee for the past 8 years, and 3 weeks ago was recently elected to the Lexington Board of Selectmen.
Well, congratulations, Mark. That's great. That's great.
Hi, I'm Meredith Elbaum. I am an architect. I'm also the executive director of the U.S. Green Building Council of Massachusetts. We are an independent organization from National U.S. Green Building Council, so when they were referencing the USGBC earlier, it gets confusing whether they're referencing us or referencing the local chapter. So to clarify, we're actually an independent organization from the national organization. We advocate and drive for more sustainable buildings, looking at operations, design, and construction for a more sustainable built environment. And I come representing people who are doing just that for the built environment.
Hi everyone, I'm Cami Peterson. I'm the Director of Clean Energy at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the regional planning agency for Greater Boston.
You're on.
Okay, I'm Carol Oldham, and I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network.
Great, thank you. Did anyone have an opening? Does everyone have an opening statement? I guess we'll start with Jacob and then go down.
Thank you. So for a number of years now, basically all I work on are zero net energy and zero net carbon buildings.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is your presentation as well?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. So do we want to maybe, I'm sorry to cut you off there. Maybe, perfect, thank you, Ron. And proceed, Jacob.
So interesting to hear the thoughts on existing versus new structures. The examples I'm going to show today are largely new, but some are renovations. We just wanted to present some of these as examples of that this is viable and possible and happening around Boston. So we go to the next slide. We like to think of our projects as scaling up this concept of zero net energy and zero net carbon. Oftentimes you think of a single family home or maybe a triple decker as a good candidate for zero carbon. But what we're seeing now is large, high-rise, dense urban structures achieving those same exciting goals. So we can flip through these pretty quickly. The next one is Harvard House Zero. It's the headquarters for Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. It is a renovation of an existing structure. To the next slide. This is Harvard's Art Lab facility, new construction. Go to the next one. This one is an interesting example. It's the Sprague building. It's a health and science facility for Bristol Community College in Fall River. The exciting thing about this project is you were asking earlier about what's the transition from LEED to zero carbon. And this was a project, it's a DCAM state-funded project, so it had to be LEED Silver Plus, similar to the Boston regulations. And so it was funded as such. And the project went on hold for approvals and funding. The basis of design had been developed. It was all standard high performance, but of course fossil fuel consuming systems. And the college said during that time when we were waiting for approvals, we are committed to achieving carbon neutral by 2050. And so we did an energy model of our proposed design, and it was going to use half of the entire campus worth of electricity consumption and 120 homes worth of natural gas. And it was going to have a huge carbon footprint. And so we went back to the drawing board and we developed a parallel design, and we proved to the state that we could do zero net carbon for no additional funding for the job, because this budget was set, we could not increase it. And that sounds crazy, but it's all about where you're going to spend the money. And it wasn't taking away from program, it was being smarter with the way that we delivered the exact same program, by right-sizing mechanical systems, by being smarter with energy recovery, using more efficient fume hoods and so forth in the labs. And so we really turned the whole paradigm on its head and came across the finish line without going beyond the construction contingency during construction, during a period when other projects were going through the roof. So it really proved to us and to everybody involved in the project that this is not only real, but if you do it right, it's a no-brainer. And so that's really, to me, the takeaway is we just have to be smarter, not spend more money. We can go through the last few slides here in terms of scaling up. This is the Chelsea Soldiers Home. It's going out to bid on Tuesday for construction. We have designed it to be zero net energy. It has geothermal. It has a large-scale solar array canopy across the roof. It has near passive house level of envelope performance. And again, by far the most life cycle cost-effective solution. This is saving the taxpayers dollars. That is the triple bottom line advantage, and it's creating this amazing environment for these people that are going to benefit from it from a healthy building standpoint, thermal comfort, and real pride in what's happening here. I mean, the Sprague building, the previous one, they were getting donors coming out of the woodwork saying, this is exciting. We care about this. We want to put our name on the conference room. We're going to give you $1 million. We were sitting in the construction trailer, and the CFO of the college looked at his phone. He said, hey, we just got another $1 million. People are excited about this. This is a big deal. So we actually just interviewed for the Mass Art recladding and replacement of mechanical systems, because their towers at the end of life for those systems. We didn't win the job, but our whole pitch was we can design this in a way that reduces the loads, looks at things more passively, is smarter, and we can put in less infrastructure that's going to require less maintenance. And I think, moving away from maybe an all glass building is sometimes one of those steps in the process that some people think is, wait a minute, I really want an all glass building. But it's just a little bit thinking differently. Too much glass can lead to glare, can lead to poor environment for art, not a better environment for art. The next slide is here also in the city. This is the BU Data Sciences building. It is a 19-story, 330,000 square foot high-rise classroom office type building that is on track. I don't want to overstep because we're still finishing the design, but the goal is to be an all-electric building, to be carbon neutral ready, and to run off of BU's off-site large-scale wind farm that they are developing. And so it will be a carbon neutral building in terms of the goals. Again, there's still issues to resolve. It's in design development, but that's the overall trajectory.
Jacob, is that on Com Ave?
Correct. So again, it's not 100% yet. We're still in design development, but it's a really exciting path and trajectory that we're on. We are also the engineers for the Boston Arts Academy facility, and that's using all air source heat pumps for a rather large scale building, which is really pushing into new territory. It's very exciting. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. That was great. We'll get through everybody before we get to some questions. And I think Cammie and Mark, you have a presentation as well, right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So while Jessica cues that up, congratulations again. We first met, you and I presented at a conference. It was either at BU or at Northeastern about a year or so ago. So it was before you were elected, so it's great to see you again.
That's right. It was a pleasure to share that panel with you before. So you had mentioned your climate action plan many times. In Lexington, we've renamed our climate action plan a sustainable action plan because we want to focus also on issues of health and resilience as well as net zero. So we can just keep going here. So in Lexington, you had asked about LEED Silver here in Boston. In Lexington, we adopted the Sustainable Building Policy, which was basically LEED Silver in 2005. We became one of the first 5 green communities in 2010 when we adopted the Stretch Energy Code. And in 2013, the town adopted a warrant article that said that we would, climate change warrant article that said we would consider climate change in all appropriate decisions and planning processes within the town. And one of the first things that we decided to do as a result of that was to put solar on our schools and solar on our landfills. And right now we have solar energy that is providing 45% of Lexington's municipal electricity demand from our rooftops and our landfills. And in 2017, we can keep going. You've mentioned many times about the emissions in Boston. We have a very similar type of profile in Lexington. 66% of our emissions comes from our buildings, 36% from electricity. So our number one goal in Lexington, when we're looking at how do we reduce our emissions, we need to look at electricity. And so we adopted a community choice program that is now providing for 10,000 customers in Lexington 100% renewable electricity for less money than they would be paying from Eversource. So we have done the same thing in the last year for our municipal electricity supply. We have converted all of our municipal electricity supply to 100% renewable electricity. And last year, I mentioned the Sustainable Action Plan. The Board of Selectmen adopted the Sustainable Action Plan, as well as the Getting to Net Zero Emissions Plan, which we took a lot of leadership from Cambridge on. I have to thank them a lot for their help in sort of ushering us along the way. The goal is for Lexington to have all of our buildings, all residential buildings, all commercial buildings, all municipal buildings, 100% powered by 100% renewable energy sources over the next 25 years. And you mentioned leadership many times. Let's go to the next slide. In order to demonstrate our leadership, we decided to update that 2005 Sustainable Building Policy, which was a LEED Silver construction policy, to look at the outcomes that we desired. And interestingly enough, while you're focusing here on net carbon zero, we have those goals, but in Lexington we decided that health was the preeminent goal that we wanted for our Sustainable Action Plan, our Sustainable Building Policy. So we're based on LEED, but we're achieving all of the LEED indoor air quality points. We're achieving we're achieving significant energy efficiency points. We're defining how much renewable energy we want on each building, and we're achieving all the resilience points. So let's just keep going forward here. So this is how they're related. The Sustainable Action Plan is the overarching goals for the town of Lexington in terms of many different sectors. We have 10 different sectors in the building sector. The Getting to Net Zero Emissions Plan is what is driving our progress forward. We can keep going. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, but the Getting to Net Zero Emission Plan is basically 4 words. We're reporting. This is your building energy use disclosure ordinance that we're following in the footsteps with. You have to reduce the amount of energy. There's only 2 ways you can reduce emissions. You can either be more efficient with your energy efficiency, or you can switch to cleaner sources of fuel. We're looking at producing the maximum amount of renewable energy on site and purchasing the rest from renewable electricity. Keep going. And as I mentioned before, we have implemented a community choice program, next slide, to keep this moving forward. And this is what our Getting to Net Zero emissions waterfall looks like, and you'll see that most of our emissions reductions in this big blue area come from switching to zero emissions electricity. Then there's energy efficiency retrofits, and as you had mentioned, we want to be putting in place in the next 10 years or so a net zero new construction policy. Next. So back to the net zero buildings, which is the point of your hearing today. We are right now in the process of developing the Hastings School. This is our net zero building. The steel is going up right now. This school will have remarkable indoor air quality. Councilor Flynn mentioned the notion of how do you protect your students when you're near a highway. Our Hastings School is about 50 yards from Route 128. On the east side of that, so the westerly winds are blowing those highway fumes right towards the school. We are building the school to achieve all of the indoor air quality goals of LEED. Plus, we are, in addition to that, putting in MERV 16 filters, a little wonky thing here, 95% reduction in particulate matter. That ends up costing us about $200 a year in filters. It doesn't change the capital cost of the building. We are, let's stick on the building here. So the roof of the building, when we were asked, could we do this net zero, we were told it's impossible. It's a 3-story building, 110,000 square feet. We need to have the roof space dedicated to HVAC. And we said, well, what if we switch to a ground source heat pump? Then the roof will be completely free. We now have the roof 100% covered in solar panels, but that still isn't good enough for us in order to achieve net zero. We are now out in the parking lot. We are producing twice as much power from the parking lot as we are from the rooftops. We've just gotten our bids back from our solar developers. We're going to generate 1.1 million kilowatt hours of electricity from the rooftops and the canopies. The building is only requiring 900,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, so we're going to be producing about 20% more electricity than we need in order to operate the building. And because we've invested in remarkable envelope, this is 50% lower energy than a code building. So that means that we're going to produce all of our electricity on site. We're going to reduce our, and this is a solar plus storage project. So we're going to be reducing our peak energy demand charges. We're going to be reducing our electricity demand charges. We're going to reduce our costs of operating the building by $250,000 a year. Plus, as you're probably aware, there's a lot of incentives from the state for doing solar, for doing storage, for doing ground source heat pumps. And we will be having a net change of $400,000 a year in operating expenses from this building. So we're going to make more money by designing a net zero building and have a healthier building as a result. And so if the last slide is just our economic analysis, I know other people would like to go forward. I'd be happy to talk about this with you at some later point in time. But the facts are that we will be generating, this school will cost us less money to operate from the first day we move into it, and we'll have better health outcomes for our students and staff.
You can clap for that. That's well done, Mark. And can we get a copy of that, particularly the last couple of slides on the Hastings School, to show my colleagues? So you're not net zero carbon, you're net negative 20% carbon because you're generating so much extra.
Net
well
positive,
done.
yes.
Well done. Thank you. Meredith, did you have a presentation as well?
I don't have a presentation.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to, a lot of what's been said today is supporting what I want to talk about. So as mentioned, USGBC Massachusetts, we are working on a report. It's in draft form right now that is on the cost of zero energy buildings in Massachusetts. We, Integral Group out of DC has produced the calculations and done the body of the report for us with help from Jacob and Chris Schaffner and others of our local experts here. And some of the projects that we've heard about, King Open, the Sprague building, are referenced within the report. What we did, so I will back up and say about almost a year ago, not quite a year ago, we had a municipal summit. We had about 80 people from different municipalities around the Commonwealth, and we asked what the #1 obstacle to getting to zero energy buildings was. They all said first cost. Mm-hmm. And so this study looks at that, and what we're saying now is, well, there's a perception of first cost. And we looked at 6 different building types in the Commonwealth, and what we found is that the first is looking at, well, we need to first reduce the energy, right? To get to zero energy building, the first thing you need to do is reduce the energy. You just said you got to 50% reductions, which is huge, and that's what the study correlates, is that on average what we looked at doing is looking at these energy conservation measures that we could reduce energy use in these buildings 40 to 50% with technologies and strategies that we have today. The number, and what we talk about in the report, are there are a lot of different factors that go into that first cost. And from what Jacob was saying, it's about design. It's about getting the design team on early. The spray guy, I think, is sometimes an exception where you have a design of a building and you can tweak it, and where the earlier you get the design team on board and you say, this is our goal from day one, then you can do it. Because you're not going to end up with a 100% glass building, or or maybe you will, but that's going to cost you a lot more money than if you right-size the equipment, right-size your glass. I'll say King Open School story the design teams tell me is that they noticed that their existing classroom building had a huge plug load. And they went through and they realized that it was because there were a lot of toasters and refrigerators and hot plates in each of the classrooms. And what they found from that was that because the break rooms for the teachers was too far away. So in the new design of the building, they designed team rooms that are easily accessible for the teachers, and the modeling, again, this is predicted, says they're going to show just 7% reduction in energy use from the design of the building. That doesn't cost any more to do. It's about having smart designers, smart design teams, having this as a goal early on in the design, asking the right questions. And so what we found with this study, looking at existing buildings that have been built or in design, and also other studies, that the first cost can be anywhere from 0, it could go up to 7%. The newer findings are not up to the 16 and above percent. It's really anywhere from 0 to 7% in Massachusetts to reduce the energy use. Of course, you're going to have added costs. If you own the solar on site from day one, it would be added cost to have solar, or you can be creative and finance the solar, and then there's no added cost from day one there as well. What we then did, and this is, I think, a theme that we're hearing, is that we need to shift the discussion from those first costs. We know we can do those first costs, but really understanding the long-term costs of these projects and look over the life cycle of these projects. And that's what we've done in this study. And in every case, it made financial sense to do these projects in that it was anywhere from 1 year payback to be 0 energy or 0 carbon. In the worst case scenario, it was 23 years. That was the absolute worst case scenario. On average, it was about a 10-year return. This took into account the energy savings. It takes into account the rebates that might be available and all. And that was assuming ownership of the solar on site. I could touch a little bit on the different rating systems. There are many of those. That would be something that we could talk about. LEED Zero is brand new. There's also the International Living Future Institute has a 0 energy and 0 carbon all the way up to living building certifications. They're different certifications, but they're really pathways to get there. And I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Cami, and you do have a presentation as well.
I do,
okay,
yes.
So Jessica is on it and Ron is on it.
Great. And I'm going to bring it up just a little bit more high level. First, thank you again to Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Wu for having me here today and having us all to discuss this. It's wonderful partnering with you guys as always, and with the city as well. We're wonderful partners in all the work that we do at MAPC for our region. So I want to talk a little bit today about how cities are leading on clean energy and climate, and provide some context on how I see a potential commitment like this fitting into the work that the city is doing and that the region is doing. You can start on the next slide. Everyone here knows MAPC is, like I mentioned, the regional planning agency. We serve 101 cities and towns, Boston included, in that 495 arc. Go on to the next slide. And we've been working with our cities and towns, with our regions, on that net zero framework to really benefit from the multiple ways that zero net energy and zero net carbon can move us toward a better climate future. Go on to the next. Net zero plans are really what we're seeing out of a lot of cities and towns right now. Obviously, carbon-free Boston is a wonderful step in that direction. The Climate Action Plan will take us further here in Boston. And cities and towns around North America are putting those plans forward, and we're learning a lot from our neighbors across the country. So as was mentioned here today, Boston has had a history of setting ambitious goals in the municipal sector as well as beyond. So just a couple clips here that I pulled. One from the 2014 Climate Action Plan update, which just references how there has been, and I think it's since 2007, the LEED Silver certification commitment for municipal new construction, and how the city's been looking at moving that forward, how the most recent inventory has shown that it met the municipal emissions goal 5 years early. So there's this history of Boston leading on working to reduce emissions in the municipal sector, and that's something that I'm excited to see them do going forward to 2030 and 2050. Next. one of the coalitions that the city is a part of is the Metro Mayors Coalition. So MAPC facilitates this coalition among 15 cities and towns in the inner core, and we've been working since 2015 with this city and with these other cities and towns on climate. In 2015, coming together around a climate preparedness commitment, and in 2016 around a climate mitigation commitment. And that included being net zero as a region by 2015. As everyone knows, the city, as do many of the other cities and towns in that region, have individual net zero or carbon-free goals by 2050 as well. Go on to the next. As part of that, too, we committed to near-term actions. By 2020, everyone in the Metro Mayors Coalition is to have updated or produced, for those who didn't have, a climate action plan. Boston is well on their way to doing that. And to undertaking 3 new climate mitigation actions. There's a list of 21, there's just a small subset here, but really to highlight that municipal facilities was a big part of that commitment. And those were ways to fulfill that commitment to moving forward to climate mitigation, was to take action in the municipal sector. Here we have adopting a certified green building standard. Obviously Boston has that with their LEED Silver since 2007, but if they were to adopt a new net zero carbon commitment or something of that like, that would be a great way to show leadership in the Metro Mayors Coalition. It would also comply with, satisfy one of those other mitigation actions that the city is undertaking by 2020, and would fit well into the work that the Metro Mayors Coalition is looking to do together to work toward regionally reducing our carbon emissions as cities and towns. Next. So just some examples too of other ways that we're seeing this, and we've seen a lot of great examples already. Heard from Cambridge, we work with as part of Metro Mayors as well, from Lexington, who's provided a great example for many years. Just want to highlight a few others. So the town of Wayland last year, right around this time, voted in town meeting to commit their municipal new construction to a very high performance standard. They don't call it net zero carbon or net zero energy per se, but it's the same standards, the same type of definitions as we've been talking about, and making sure their energy and their emissions are reduced greatly in any new municipal construction. That passed overwhelmingly in town meeting there last year. In the town of Amherst, out in Western Mass, once again about a year ago, they now have this revised zero energy town building bylaw that they've been working on, a very ambitious way of seeing how all new buildings built in the town are really reducing energy to zero, really trying to produce most of any sort of renewables that would offset energy use on site, and then bringing in some off-site energy only if it's really necessary toward the end. So a very ambitious policy out in Amherst. Then leaving the Commonwealth and showing just some other examples of how around the country this is happening. The District of Columbia just this January adopted a very ambitious plan. It covers many different areas, but one that I wanted to highlight was their district government buildings. So in talking about the retrofit sector, which has been discussed in great detail already today, and how that's a tougher nut to crack in many cases, obviously very important since we mostly have existing buildings. They're looking to put forward this zero energy, and they've committed to this zero energy retrofit program across at least 12.5% of the district portfolio of buildings by 2032. Santa Monica has a really ambitious climate action and adaptation plan as well, and you can see here just the budget numbers they've put forward in their capital improvement program for zero net carbon buildings in the municipal sector. A really great example. And lastly, just wanted to highlight really as a representation of the importance of moving that municipal sector forward in a commitment that C40 has put out recently. So they're having cities and towns and some other statewide actors commit to zero net carbon buildings across the sectors, commercial, industrial, residential, and so on. But they also have this subset, and it's very small up there, but happy to share it in more detail. The second kind of highlighted area there is talking about municipal buildings and committing to zero net carbon in that space as well. And I think it's really notable how they call out the reasons for that being the importance of leading by example, the importance of piloting and demonstrating really innovative pathways to get there, the importance of showing the market and other constituents how it's possible and that you can move forward on it together. And we really see this important at that scalable level. This isn't something that just Boston should be doing, that Cambridge and Lexington and others are doing, but something that we want to see our Metro Mayors Coalition region and across the state be stepping forward to really commit to these type of aggressive carbon emission reduction policies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cammie. Appreciate it. Thanks. Carol, you're up.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley, and thank you, Councilor Wu, for your leadership on this issue. So Matt is not only a leader on this, but he is also my own counselor. So MCAN is a statewide organization that works with chapters in cities and towns across Massachusetts to help their communities be more climate friendly and to give those communities a voice at the state level. One of the issues that we're working on a lot with a lot of communities on is net zero planning. And we've been working a lot with the Boston Clean Energy Coalition, which you mentioned earlier. That's a coalition of grassroots and neighborhood groups that wants to see Boston go net zero and is currently focused on ensuring that we stop digging the hole on climate. And what I mean by that is that, of course, the first best step to getting out of a hole is to stop digging. And every building that we build now that is not net zero is going to have to be retrofitted later. And that is going to be very expensive. Municipal buildings are particularly important for this. As was mentioned earlier, the city can save money and help meet the Commonwealth's goals while doing the right thing on building by building all new municipal buildings net zero carbon. The fact that buildings are the largest percentage of the climate pollution for our city makes it clear we need to fix the way that we are building our buildings, and we need to do it now. The 2018 UN report from the International Panel on Climate Change says that globally we have to go net zero by 2050. And a leader city like Boston and in a leader state like Massachusetts should be focused on beating that timeline by a significant chunk of time. The mayor's own commitment and the carbon-free Boston modeling says net zero buildings are a key part of that. We must address the built environment, and it is important to the people of Boston that the city do the right thing. The current building boom in Boston, which is the third largest ever, makes this even more pressing. The city needs to provide leadership and to prove that this is possible. City government needs to lead Boston, and Boston should be leading the state. In my work across Massachusetts, I have seen that although they don't always admit it, cities and towns around Massachusetts really look to Boston for leadership, and that is true nationally as well. And that's one of the major reasons that I think the city can and should lead by example and show what's possible by having all new municipal buildings be net zero.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate that. A week ago today, last Thursday, I held the Irish flag raising in honor of St. Patrick's Day, and we had a wonderful little cotillion beforehand where we had Irish step dancers, this amazing singer, Irish soda bread, bagpipes, everything. And one of my colleagues, as we were leaving, put his arm around me and said, "Thank you so much. You have me all revved up for St. Patrick's Day now." So I want to say to all of you, thank you so much. You have me all revved up for net zero carbon. I mean, it was just, that's exactly what I wanted. You just very surgically explained why this is important, how we can do it, what we're up against, what the benefits are. I mean, the Hastings School, that's just, how many students are going to be in the Hastings School? 645 students. So it's a big school. It's a very big school. Yeah. And what was the total cost of the building, do you know? $65 million. That was the total cost? Yes. What's the cost of Boston Arts Academy? I know we're doing good things there, but it's a lot more than, it's probably double that, I would think.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. I know Bristol Community College was $30 million.
And that's net zero carbon? They've
Significantly carbon negative, actually.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
That is remarkable. So I want to get through some questions, then throw to Michelle. Meredith, you talked about sort of averages 10-year return, and worst case scenario is 23-year return, and then you factor in sort of rebates and incentives. There's a long preamble to this question, but I think you all will appreciate it, perhaps be as gobsmacked as I was when I heard the other night our senior senator was on doing a presidential town hall forum in Mississippi, and really good questions and good answers. And one question I did not believe was real until I Googled it, just the question. The question was that in the state of Mississippi, they are now imposing a tax on electric and hybrid vehicles to offset the lack of revenue by a gas tax. That's actually happening. So my question to you, Meredith, is, and it's somewhat off topic, but since you're all here, I will ask, despite the incredible damage that this administration, Washington, is doing to everything, including climate, are there some concerns as it relates to tax incentives that the federal government had promoted? I'm thinking there used to be a great incentive for I have an electric vehicle, for example. There used to be a great incentive for that. Are those things changing, and are there ways? It's a two-part question. Have you noticed that in your research, federal programs dissipating or being phased out, if not outwardly turned around like in the Mississippi situation? And then are there ways that cities can better offer our own incentives?
Yeah, I might pass some of this over to Jacob because I think
Okay.
he's more intimately tied to this. Although I think a lot of the rebates and incentives that we're getting are at the state level, and I think there is a lot that can be done even to further it at the city level. You know, the rebates help.
Yeah.
But I'm going to pass it on to you because you're more intimate.
Well, you probably know the latest on the timeline for the solar drawdown on those federal incentives.
Yes, the solar incentives are, have a 5-year sunset on the ITC credit for both residential and commercial. But I think you're exactly right in terms of looking locally. When we look at Hastings School and the things that we're able to do for Hastings School, those incentives are coming from the state level. So we have the Smart Solar Energy Program, which is providing incentives not only for the solar, but for the energy storage portion of the arrays that we're putting up. We have a grant from Mass CEC for the ground source heat pumps, some of the initial capital expense. The administration at the DOER level has got the alternative portfolio standard in place, which is allowing a production incentive for the life of the ground source heat pump. For every kilowatt hour of heat that you provide with a ground source heat pump, you're getting an incentive from the state. So we're making money by heating our schools with a ground source heat pump.
Yeah, I think there's exciting opportunities, as you described, for the alternative energy credits from DOER, and there could be similar programs in place where you can build off of existing structures, right? To say that maybe you can have, you know, the 7x multiplier if you're zero net energy and a 5x multiplier if you're not. So you're still promoting efficiency for everybody, but you get a bonus if you get all the way to carbon neutral.
For the
So
alternative,
that's for the alternative energy credits. You could do, you know, we're trying to work with the utilities and changing their programs so that when you fuel switch to electric, you can still maximize your incentive, even though a lot of the incentives come from reducing electric consumption. So we've been working on using the Chelsea Soldiers Home, which we showed, as potentially a pilot for a new structure that would really take advantage of what are the real environmental benefits to the system.
Good. And Cammie,
just to add quickly too, to the alternative energy credits, if you have a small system, I mean that's small commercial as well, you can even get the credits pre-minted, so it can help to offset the initial capital cost and really bring down the cost of building the building, because you can get all up front those credits that would have been over the lifetime, you would get them before you were building, and so that can be a really helpful incentive as well. To your EV question, the Commonwealth still has intact a good number of our EV incentive and rebate programs, and there have actually been some additional funding that's come in the last couple of months, thanks to the Volkswagen settlement. So that there are still rebates for residents through the More EV program. I think the state is looking to cap those so that if you're buying a very expensive EV, you might not get the rebates, but you still would for most EVs that are being purchased. And for municipal fleets and workplace charging and those types of rebates, those are still intact at the state level.
You know what developers care about? Square footage.
Yeah.
So I was talking with Seth earlier about the FAR zoning regs that they're looking at to provide adders and more, allow higher FAR and higher height restrictions potentially for zero net energy buildings that are getting out ahead of their timeline. So that's a big deal. Or if you're trying to rezone a site for higher density and you need, municipal buy-in to allow that to occur, there's a leverage point for you to say, hey, developer, we think you should also be pursuing carbon neutral as part of your benefits to the community.
Yeah. No, hey, there's no question that in a large benefit from our work at the working session with many people in this room is, oftentimes when a new development will come to our neighborhood, or obviously Michelle represents the entire city, there'll always be a push for increased affordability on site. Very, very important. We're going to continue to push that. But we should also, and there could be other pushes for other community benefits, a community room, for example, that a civic association could use. We've made a real push on getting to NZC or as close to it. And we had a large victory in West Roxbury with a 250-unit building that's going to be all electric. It's not quite net zero carbon, but it's going to be all electric, and that's something that happened because of our advocacy, and we'll continue to push. As it relates more to municipal buildings, I guess I would characterize the administration's response as very supportive of it, wanted to make sure that we're able to look at other factors and sort of codifying changes going forward. I guess there's always the concern about cost, either the perception of first cost or the actual cost. I guess what would be some of your remarks to sort of assuage some of the fears that the administration or that others may have, that want to do the right thing but are worried about cost? So we'll just jump in with you, Mark.
This is the exact question that you get when you start talking about putting a net zero building up. How much is it going to cost, and what's the payback time going to be? And what we've suggested in Lexington is that's probably the wrong way to look at it. How many of you buy a house, how many of you buy a school with cash up front? Nobody. We buy a house, we finance it. We go out for a bond, and the interesting thing is when you look at the cost of the ground source heat pump that we put in at Hastings School, that's an incremental cost over code. But if you look at what that incremental cost is in terms of the actual payments that you're making on your debt service, and what we found is that we were saving more energy than we were costing ourselves in our debt service. So we're saving $400,000 in energy plus $150,000 in incentives we're getting from the state, and our debt service for putting the ground source heat pump in is $50,000. So we're ahead of the game from the very first day. So we're suggesting probably the wrong way to sell a net zero system is to talk about first cost and 25-year paybacks, but probably the right way to talk about it is what's my actual cost to the taxpayer? The cost to the taxpayer is the debt service and the operating costs of operating that building. And if you look at those two things together, you'll find if you do the design with a good engineering firm up front, you will find that you will be net zero and you will be cash flow positive from the first day you turn that building on.
We had, I live in Belmont, and we're building a new 400,000 square foot, $300 million high school and partial junior high.
$300 million high school?
295, wow. Yeah, it's up there. So we've been heavily involved as community advocates in that process and had the exact same experience where we were able to prove at every step in the process that every decision from geothermal to solar on the roof to buying any additional renewable energy that we needed off-site that we couldn't fit on the building to get to that 7x multiplier on the geothermal, at every single step, it was cash flow positive, more cash flow positive, more cash flow positive. I mean, absolutely just flip the thought process on its head, and it's a no-brainer.
You say, why wouldn't you do this?
Yeah,
right.
I like that. Cammy, you talked a little bit about sort of some other municipalities, and you referenced D.C. example as someone who's being really aggressive. Would you say if you had to look at a city in the United States, is it D.C., is it Santa Monica, is it another place that's really sort of setting the gold standard in terms of how we should be looking at this, as specifically as it relates to municipal buildings?
It's a good question. Many cities function in very different ways, have different constraints in different contexts, so it's hard to kind of compare them apples to apples. Many are doing very good things in different ways that we should be looking at. DC most definitely, and especially as they approach retrofits and take a look at their existing building stock and kind of are doing things across their portfolio. Seattle is doing great things in terms of their green code and how they incorporate green infrastructure and the benefits that can have not just for resiliency, but in reducing heating loads and wind loads and really reducing our energy use as well. Santa Monica does have a really ambitious way of incorporating their capital improvement plans. There's definitely lessons to be learned from that. Chicago and Toronto are really good examples of their green roof, which speaks to some of the benefits I mentioned a minute ago. Vancouver and New York have very inclusive plans right now, and I think it's similar to the planning that Boston's been undertaking, really looking to have equity considerations across the spectrum and being very aggressive in how they approach different sectors. So I don't know if I would point to one as being the leader overall, but there's certainly really good examples out there that we can be pulling from, and that I know that the team in Boston has been looking at, and they look to us for some of that from that leadership as well, and there's a lot of good lessons out there to pull from.
Excellent, thank you. And Carol, can you talk to us about changing the international code and how you've dragooned me into doing this?
Sure, absolutely. And I will say that your video is extremely popular
Excellent.
online. It's getting a lot of hits, so
Good.
thank you so much for doing that. So we are working with MAPC and Sierra Club and NEEP. Okay, I'm trying to think who I'm forgetting, on changing the base building code nationally by getting pro-efficiency eligible officials to register and vote coming this fall. And I'm happy to say that we have we're going to have a couple hundred new folks from Massachusetts be registered as of our latest look, and so I think we're going to win the vote.
Excellent, excellent, great, thank you. Councillor Wu?
Thank you all so much. It's, really inspiring and energizing. I want to note before any questions that I was doing some research and found I think what they were referencing in the last panel. It was a 2007 executive order by Mayor Menino that required that all city buildings be LEED silver, and there were some other pieces in there too. So because it's an executive order, that means it could just be an ordinance too, well within our jurisdiction. So I think, I guess if you had one kind of next step for Boston, given what you've heard and kind of where you see the gaps might be or the opportunities might be, what would it be?
I would say take your biggest energy hog and make it net zero, which might be this building. Not sure.
I would say focus on health. When you take a look at fiscal responsibility and when we look at our budgets in Lexington, we see that we're spending 40 times more on staff and salaries and health benefits than we are on energy costs for our buildings, 40x. So it's a factor of 120 to $3 million. And what we look at is when you design your building with an excellent energy design firm, they're designing in order to achieve net zero, they're designing with thermal comfort, they're designing with temperature control, they're designing with humidity control, they're putting good daylighting in the building. And what you find is you get remarkable health outcomes, and those remarkable health outcomes have an impact on your financial bottom line of operating your institutions. For example, you will see that you have better, fewer absenteeisms, both from students and from teachers. You have better teacher retention. They like to work in buildings like this. You have higher productivity. You have better cognitive performance if you're doing schools. All of these things have dramatic impacts on that 40x number that you're looking at in terms of your bottom line for the, so if, when in Lexington, when you look at our costs, you're talking about emissions in terms of your 70% of your emissions are from buildings. Well, in Lexington, 70% of our costs are staff and salaries and health benefits. And what's our best way to influence those costs? It's designing good buildings.
I would say to go for it, that we should be having all municipal buildings be net zero, that we can do this now, that we have the best designers in the country who are able to do this. There are more people, Jacob's one of them, but there are a slew of architects and engineers here who know how to do this and can do this, and that if you ask them to do it, they're going to be up to the challenge to make it happen. I would also think to your point, to think holistically. Make sure that we're looking at the right target, which is overall carbon emission reductions. I caution the approach that Jacob actually said about the adder, because the number one thing that we can do to curb carbon emissions is to not build anything. And so if we are adding more space, it might be net zero to operate, but there's still, I've said this to Councilman O'Malley before, that there's still the embodied carbon of the materials that's going into that. And so we need to be thinking holistically. We need to quickly also be thinking about the existing buildings, because the best thing that we could do is say, nope, we're not going to build anything new. Maybe we give an adder for thinking about building smaller, thinking about building smarter. What do we really need to build? How do we optimize our buildings? And thinking, and then getting to the existing building side of that. Within that, also thinking about the big picture of holistically about what we're building those buildings of, because again, you can be building a zero net energy building, and you can significantly reduce the amount of carbon that building is responsible for by the materials. By if it's built from wood instead of steel or instead of concrete, and so that we might be looking at the whole picture instead of just the operational energy and operational carbon, but looking at if we have the tools in terms of life cycle assessment to understand the entire carbon profile of a building and factoring that in. So for instance, you could put enough more insulation in a building than the building is going to save in terms of carbon because of the embodied footprint, the embodied carbon of that insulation. So we have to be careful there. It's tricky. We know how to do it. There are points in LEED that help you get there. And that's one thing that gets you to LEED, that there are some programs that are so focused on the energy and the carbon that the building is producing that we're forgetting about the health and well-being of the occupants. We're forgetting about how people get to the building. So the LEED Zero, for instance, when you're looking at zero, is actually for energy, for carbon, energy, water, and waste for LEED Zero. And in that, the energy actually adds transportation into that. And so this isn't necessarily a problem for Boston, but when you look outside, you can have a net zero building in the middle of nowhere, and people have to fly planes to get to it. Well, that's not going to really accomplish the goal. And so thinking holistically about the big picture, so when you're looking at the executive order, that looks specifically at LEED, and I urge you not to forget about the big picture of how this all the pieces fit together.
Thank you.
I would also suggest, Councilor, you mentioned electric vehicles. My daughter lives in Boston in the North End, and we were talking last night about what she's going to buy. She says, I'd like to have an electric vehicle, but she lives in the North End. She doesn't have any place to charge her car. So when you're thinking about buildings, the number one place to charge a car is either at your house or at your place of work. And if we're doing net zero energy standards, we should also be thinking about putting the infrastructure in place while we're building those buildings. Well, it costs 20 times less than doing it afterwards to build in electric vehicle charging capability.
And Councilor Wu's done some great work in this space, and I would just say in the North End, right out front on Cambridge Street, there are 6 municipal charging stations. I've almost always found a spot there, and it's probably a 7-minute walk to the North End. So
And I've seen my
to
daughter's car there.
Yeah. So, Kemi.
I would echo what my colleagues up here have said. I think it's really important, too, to set the specific timeline, taking a page from Cambridge's book. However you go about amending or creating a new ordinance, or if it's included, as I expect, in the climate action plan, having that 2022 for municipal buildings, 2025 for residential, and so on, so that the marketplace knows, the builders know, the residents know, and everyone can really do what's needed between now and then to get there. The cost point, I think, is really important, too, and thinking about it to Meredith's point in that holistic sense. Without carbon pricing, it's always hard to really incorporate the externalities of climate and carbon into the costs that we have, and upfront cost-benefit analyses don't integrate that, but health is a huge part of it. So are the transportation costs and the benefits that we get from that, from reducing carbon, and the equity considerations that are hard to quantify, but are part of that equation as well, and so many others. So I would encourage kind of thinking about cost a little bit more holistically as well. And lastly, just I would say, in terms of cost and the pricing for things, Boston's, taking a lot of good strides lately with their energy service performance contracting, what was talked about with Renew Boston Trust, and the operational savings that you get from that, from the energy conservation measures that you pursue. And I would encourage thinking potentially about how that money then is dedicated for use, and if there's a way to dedicate a portion of that savings toward maybe some of that initial upfront cost, that 0 to 7% that might be the additional cost of building a net zero carbon building, or thinking creatively in other ways to dedicate that funding so it doesn't become a drawback on the overall capital budget.
So I just want to boost Meredith's first point, which is that that I think the key is to go ahead and do it. and that we have the tools to do it. I think if there is discomfort on the part of the city staff, then they should be encouraged to really look into those costs, because I think that, as everybody's pointed out, if you think about the energy costs to maintain the building, if you think about financing and you take into account the incentives, I think a net zero building is clearly comes out ahead for the city. So I think once the analysis is done, if there's discomfort, do the analysis, ask them to do the analysis, and I think it'll be very clear that this is the right thing to do.
Well said. And I think, I don't know if it was Tricia or maybe Chris who said the average, or I may have read this, so I don't want to attribute it to someone, but the average lifespan of a municipal building is about 50 years. And if the worst case scenario Meredith cited was that it takes 23 years to actualize a return, you will see double the return. That's a pretty compelling argument. So
You're never going to live down that 23 years now.
But that's the worst. But no, we're always going to.
This is the absolute
Absolute
worst case in
worst.
this.
10 years is the average, so it would be five. It would be more likely 5 times. Thank you very much. Well, I cannot thank you all enough. You've been very generous with your time and your expertise, not only today but leading up. Any closing comments before we have a couple people who've signed up for public testimony? Well, I thank you all. It's great, and we will continue to work. Michelle and I will follow up in the weeks ahead, and we'd really love your input on sort of our next steps.
Looking forward to being on a panel with you again.
Absolutely, me too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you can clap for them. I'm not a stickler for the clapping rules. I apologize, I know Bob Tompowski was the first to sign up. I believe he had to leave, so we'll make sure we get him next time. Jairam Rojo, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Oh, Jairam, please. Who's with BSAC. So you know what, Jairam, rather than standing up there, grab a seat right up here. And if your colleague wants to get a picture, they can come on the floor too. Absolutely, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the city councilors and organizers present. My name is Jairam Rao, and I'm a senior at the Boston Latin School. I'm here today on behalf of the Boston Student Advisory Council and Youth on Board, an organization composed of students like myself who care deeply about the future of our city. I'll begin with a brief story. The environment was always important to me. I recycled and turned off the tap and helped my dad install LED lights, but the environment didn't dominate every waking hour of my mind. But lately it does. Around this time last year, I was sitting in the front row of my AP Environmental Science class. The lights were off, and the title of a film burned bold against the projector screen, Before the Flood. I remember my teacher saying, "This is the most important thing I'm going to show you all year." I believed him to an extent. I thought perhaps we were going to see the key chart or graph that would help us ace the AP exam in a few months. But it ended up being a lot more than that. Images of smog-choked cities, coastal flooding, and rivers on fire struck me in a way that they hadn't before. All I could imagine was smog so thick it obscured the Hancock Tower, the aquarium knee-deep in seawater, and the Charles River so clogged with trash and oil that it burns for days. That day, everything we had studied in the past 7 months became very, very real. In fact, and I don't say this lightly, my life gained purpose that day, because that was the day I became angry. I began to look in my own city for those who profit off the destruction of our environment. And who did I find but fossil fuel giants like ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell? According to the city's Environment Department, public, commercial, and residential buildings account for 70.6% of citywide greenhouse gas emissions. The Net Zero Buildings Plan is a real and viable opportunity to reduce the city's total emissions by millions of metric tons per year. We would be well on track to meet our emissions goals for the coming decades. You all here today have the opportunity to make a significant dent in our city's carbon emissions by bringing every new structure into the 21st century before contractors even break ground. The Net Zero Buildings Plan is more than just desirable, it's necessary. Luckily for us, it can be implemented with a modicum of willpower on your part, and the returns on investment will be both immediate and long-lasting for every citizen of Boston. 6 days ago, hundreds of young people, nearly all of whom will be voting in 2020, demonstrated outside the State House for climate action. Our votes will speak loudly next year, and they will tell you what our future will look like. This is our chance to make a significant step in the right direction, because if anyone can do it, a city of scientific innovators, engaged citizens, and responsive legislators like Boston can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do you know where you're headed, what your plans are for next year?
Boston University, so
Good
you might
man.
be seeing me around again.
Good, excellent. Be you.
Could I just say, I think you should did you prepare that just for here, or had you? You should just edit slightly some of the, submit it as an op-ed somewhere. I think it's really important for everyone to read it, and I'd love to follow up to suggest maybe places that would publish it immediately, but you should put that in. And the only other comment that I have is, don't forget that it's not just about 2020. This year matters a lot for elections too, and that there are now multiple open seats on the council and other places, so these races are incredibly important for climate policy too. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Wu. That's all I have for public testimony, unless anyone else would like to speak now or forever hold their peace. All right? Should I not? Yeah, no, yeah. Don't speak now, but don't hold your peace either. Do I adjourn it, or I guess it doesn't matter? Okay. All right. So, talking with my colleague and partner in crime on this, we are going to recess this hearing, and I think we have a clear indication on some effective next steps that we can take. But I really appreciate each and every one of you for being here, for the administration, for their great work, for our really remarkable panelists, and to all of you who've stuck around, particularly those from the BCEC who have been really invaluable allies and partners in this. The work endures, and the work goes on, the cause endures, and I'm really looking forward to seeing some great action happening out of this committee and out of this body. So the hearing on docket 0185 is hereby recessed.